I never believed in ghosts before I worked at Black Ridge County Jail in rural Oklahoma. I believed in violent inmates, drug addicts, murderers, guys who'd smile at you while describing things that would make your stomach turn. But ghosts? No, that was movie stuff. I was 26 when I got hired as a night correctional officer. The pay was decent, and after getting laid off from a warehouse job, I needed something fast. Black Ridge was an old jail built in the 1950s, surrounded by miles of empty highway and dead farmland. During orientation, one of the older guards joked that the place should have been condemned years ago. I thought he was exaggerating. Then I started working nights in cell block D. The first weird thing happened during my third week. At around 2:30 a.m., I was doing routine checks with another officer named Ramirez. Most inmates were asleep, except for the occasional yelling or banging. Pretty normal stuff. As we passed cell 14, Ramirez suddenly stopped walking. "You hear that?" he asked. I listened carefully. At first, nothing. Then I heard it. Whispering. It sounded like multiple people talking softly at the same time. The voices were coming from inside cell 14. The problem was cell 14 was empty. Ramirez stared through the bars for several seconds before shaking his head. "Probably pipes," he muttered, but his face looked pale. When we continued walking, I looked back one more time. I swear I saw someone standing in the darkness of that empty cell. Just for a second. A tall figure. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep much after that shift. A few nights later, another officer called in sick, leaving me alone in Block D for almost 3 hours. Around midnight, I was sitting at the security desk watching monitors when one camera started flickering. Cell 14 again. The screen kept cutting in and out with static. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check it myself. The hallway was freezing cold compared to the rest of the jail. I could actually see my breath. That didn't make sense because it was the middle of July. As I approached the cell, I noticed something scratched into the concrete wall inside. "Help me." I froze. I knew for a fact that wall had been blank earlier. I stepped closer to the bars, shining my flashlight around the room. The cell was empty. Then something slammed against the back wall. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The sound echoed through the hallway, like someone had thrown their whole body against the concrete. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer. I unlocked the cell door slowly, every instinct telling me not to go inside. The second I stepped in, the smell hit me, rotting flesh. It was so strong I gagged instantly. My flashlight started flickering violently. The beam shook across the walls until it landed in the far corner. Someone was crouching there. At first, I thought it was an inmate somehow hiding inside. Then the figure slowly stood up. It was a man in an old orange prison uniform, soaked in dark stains that looked almost black under the flashlight. His head hung at an unnatural angle, like his neck had been broken. I couldn't move. The man lifted his face toward me. His eyes were completely white. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile. Way too wide. His jaw stretched so far I heard something crack. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The light rolled across the floor, spinning wildly. For a split second, the entire cell looked different, not empty anymore. The walls were covered in blood. Dozens of scratch marks lined the concrete, and hanging from the ceiling by a bedsheet was another inmate staring directly at me. Then the flashlight stopped moving. Everything returned to normal. The cell was empty again. I ran out so fast, I almost fell in the hallway. When Ramirez arrived later, he found me sitting near the control room, looking like I'd seen a murder. I told him everything. Instead of laughing, he got quiet. Then he told me the story of Cell 14. Back in 1987, an inmate named Daniel Croft was beaten to death inside that cell by 3 other prisoners during a lockdown. Guards didn't reach him for nearly 20 minutes. A week later, one of the attackers hung himself in the same cell. Another stabbed his own eyes out with a toothbrush. The third suffered a heart attack during transport after screaming that the dead man was standing outside the van. After that, inmates refused to stay in cell 14. They claimed someone whispered to them at night, promising they'd never leave alive. Eventually, the jail shut the cell permanently. But here's the part that still keeps me awake. Ramirez pulled out his phone and showed me an old black and white photo from the 1980s. It showed several inmates standing in Block D. One of them was Daniel Croft, the same man I saw smiling at me in the corner of the cell. Same broken neck, same white eyes. I quit 2 days later. About 6 months after leaving, I heard Blackridge County Jail was finally closed down after multiple staff complaints and unexplained incidents. But sometimes I still think about that hallway, that freezing cold air, and the thing I saw hanging from the ceiling. Because right before the flashlight stopped rolling, I remember one detail clearly. The hanging inmate was still moving slightly, like someone had just kicked the chair out from under him. I used to work as a prison nurse at an old detention facility just outside Quezon City. Most people imagine prisons as loud, violent places with constant screaming and fights. Sometimes it was like that. But the worst part of that jail was actually the silence at night. Especially in Building C. Building C was the oldest section of the facility. The walls were stained yellow from decades of humidity, and the power constantly failed whenever it rained hard. Inmates hated being transferred there. Guards hated working there even more. I found out why during my second month on the job. One evening, around 11 p.m., a guard named Villanueva rushed into the medical office looking shaken. "Inmate collapsed," he said quickly. "Cell C-12. I grabbed my kit and followed him through the corridor. Rain hammered the metal roof overhead, and every few seconds lightning flashed through the tiny barred windows. The deeper we went into Building C, the colder it got. That was strange because the prison had no air conditioning. When we reached Cell C-12, 3 inmates were pressed against the bars, terrified. One of them pointed toward the back of the cell. "He keeps talking to someone," the inmate whispered. On the floor was a prisoner named Javier Mendez. He was curled into a ball, sweating heavily, mumbling over and over. "She's under the bed. She's under the bed." At first, I assumed he was having some kind of breakdown. I knelt beside him and checked his pulse. Then he grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. "She crawls at night," he whispered directly into my ear. "Don't let her touch you." Before I could respond, the lights went out. The entire hallway fell into darkness. Immediately, the inmates started shouting. Somewhere nearby, metal bars began rattling violently. Villanueva cursed and turned on his flashlight. That's when we heard it. A soft scraping sound, slow, wet, like someone dragging their body across concrete. The noise was coming from underneath the bunk bed in C-12. I swept my flashlight toward it. At first, I saw nothing except darkness. Then a face slowly appeared beneath the lower bunk. It was a woman. At least I think it was. Her skin looked gray and swollen like a drowned corpse. Long black hair covered most of her face, but I could still see one eye staring directly at me. It wasn't blinking. I stumbled backward so hard I hit the bars. The inmates started screaming. Villanueva shouted, "What the hell is that?" The woman began crawling out slowly, her limbs bending the wrong way. Her prison uniform looked ancient, stained dark brown around the chest. Then the lights suddenly came back on. The space under the bed was empty, completely empty. One inmate started crying immediately. Another kept repeating prayers under his breath. Villanueva ordered everyone back against the wall while I helped Javier out of the cell. The entire time, Javier refused to open his eyes. "She followed me," he kept muttering. I saw her standing outside the bathroom. Back in the medical office, I asked another nurse if anyone had died in Building C before. The room went quiet. Finally, She told me about a former inmate named Teresa Salonga. Years earlier, Teresa had been locked in cell C12 after being accused of murdering her husband. According to rumors, she insisted she was innocent and claimed another inmate was threatening her. One night during a typhoon, guards found Teresa dead beneath her bunk bed. Officially, they ruled it a suicide, but inmates believed she had been murdered. After her death, prisoners housed in C12 started reporting strange things. They heard crying at night. Some woke up with scratches on their legs. Others claimed they saw a woman crawling across the floor after lights out. Most requested transfers within days. A week after hearing the story, I almost convinced myself it was prison gossip. Then I worked another overnight shift. Around 3 a.m., the emergency alarm in Building C activated by itself. I went with 2 guards to investigate. The hallway was empty when we arrived, but every cell door sensor was flashing red like someone had tried opening them. Then one inmate pointed toward the far end of the corridor. At the very end stood a woman with long, wet hair covering her face, perfectly still. The guards shouted at her, assuming an inmate had escaped somehow. She didn't move. One guard raised his flashlight higher. That's when we realized her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hanging in midair. The flashlight flickered once, and she disappeared. Every inmate in the hallway started screaming at the same time. One man fainted instantly. The guards ordered a lockdown, but nobody wanted to walk down that corridor again. Even the toughest officers looked terrified. I resigned 3 weeks later. Years have passed since then, but I still remember the final thing Javier told me before he was transferred to another prison. He said Teresa wasn't searching for revenge. She's looking for the person who killed her, he whispered. Then he looked directly at me and asked, "What happens when she realizes it wasn't any of the inmates?" A few years ago, I took a temporary night shift job at an old correctional facility near Kingston while finishing college. The prison was called Greystone Penitentiary. Most of it had already been shut down, but one wing was still being used to hold a small number of inmates awaiting transfer. Because the building was so old, the government planned to close it permanently within the year. Nobody wanted the night shift there. During training, the supervisor laughed and told me, "If you hear knocking underground, ignore it." Everyone else laughed too. I didn't. The prison sat beside a frozen stretch of forest far from the highway. In winter, the place looked abandoned even when occupied. Snow piled against the walls, and the wind constantly howled through cracks in the concrete. My main job was simple: monitor cameras, walk the halls every hour, and make sure the inmates stayed locked down overnight. The problem was the basement level. There were no prisoners housed there anymore, but security still required guards to inspect it twice a shift. Apparently, years ago, the basement had been used for solitary confinement. The older guards called it the pits. My first few nights were uneventful. Then I started hearing the knocking. It always happened around 1:15 a.m. 3 slow knocks, coming from below the floor. The first time I heard it, I froze at the security desk. I honestly thought someone was trapped downstairs. I radioed another guard named Fletcher. "You hear that?" I asked. He didn't even look up from his coffee. "Don't answer it," he said calmly. That response bothered me more than the sound itself. A few nights later, during my basement inspection, I found something strange. One of the solitary cell doors was open. I knew for a fact it had been locked earlier. The basement corridor smelled damp and moldy, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The cells down there were tiny concrete boxes with rusted steel doors and no windows. As I approached the open cell, I noticed scratches covering the inside walls. Hundreds of them. Not random marks either. Words. "Let me out, too cold, he's still here." Most looked decades old, but one message stood out because it looked fresh. "Don't knock back." I remember feeling this awful pressure in my chest, like my body was warning me to leave immediately. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks, directly behind me. I spun around fast enough to nearly fall. Nobody was there. The hallway was empty. But now, every single cell door in the corridor had creaked slightly open. I swear they'd all been shut seconds earlier. My radio crackled suddenly, static at first. Then a voice whispered through it. "Officer." It sounded weak, cold, like someone struggling to breathe. I grabbed the radio. "Who is this?" No answer. Then, "Please, it hurts." The voice sounded like it was coming from deep underground. At that point, I abandoned the inspection and hurried upstairs. Fletcher was waiting near the stairwell with an expression that looked more annoyed than surprised. "You heard him, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I demanded to know what was going on. At first he refused to explain, but after enough pressure, he finally told me the story. Back in the late 1970s, a violent inmate named Eric Voss was placed in basement solitary during a brutal snowstorm after attacking another prisoner. The heating system in the lower level failed overnight. By morning, guards found Voss dead inside his cell, frozen. Official reports blamed equipment failure, but rumors spread that officers ignored his cries for help because of his violent history. After his death, guards working nights began reporting strange things: knocking sounds, radios turning on by themselves, cell doors opening alone. One officer even claimed he saw a man standing outside his car in the prison parking lot during a blizzard. The man's skin was pale blue from frostbite. I tried convincing myself it was just an old ghost story meant to scare new employees, until my last week there. That night, a massive snowstorm hit the area. The power flickered constantly, and most inmates were already locked in for the night. Around 2 a.m., every security camera connected to the basement suddenly went black. Protocol required physical inspection. Fletcher refused to go down there, so I went alone. The second I opened the basement door, freezing air rushed up the stairwell. It felt colder than outside. My flashlight shook in my hand as I descended. Halfway down, I noticed footprints in the frost covering the concrete floor. Bare footprints, leading deeper into the corridor. The knocking started again. 3 slow knocks. Closer this time. I followed the sound to the final solitary cell at the end of the hallway. Its door was wide open. Inside stood a man facing the wall. He wore an old prison uniform coated in frost. His shoulders twitched unnaturally. "Sir?" I called out. The figure slowly turned around. His face was completely frozen solid. Skin cracked pale blue, eyes cloudy white, and his mouth hung open like he'd died screaming. I couldn't move. The figure lifted one stiff arm and pointed behind me. I turned instinctively. Every cell door in the basement had slammed shut at once. The echo exploded through the corridor. When I looked back, the frozen man was gone. But now the knocking came from inside the cell beside me. 3 slow knocks. From behind the steel door, something inside whispered my name. I ran harder than I ever have in my life. By morning, I had already decided to quit. Before leaving permanently, Fletcher handed me an old newspaper clipping about Eric Voss's death. At the bottom of the article was one detail never mentioned in the official report. When guards found Voss frozen in solitary, there was blood covering the inside of the cell door, because until the moment he died, he had been knocking to be let out.